Can everyone see what looks like a PowerPoint screen?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, great. Okay. Wonderful. Good morning. My name is Tom Johnston. I'm a parishioner at Epiphany. I've been around not as long as many people, longer than a few. We're going to continue our look at the book of Genesis with the big transition today. And what I hope you'll come away with is how the form and setup for the adventures of Abram and Sarai helps us understand more of what they're about and more of what God is doing in the sort of central section of Genesis. And we're going to look at the end of chapter 11, the start of chapter 12, but we're going to sort of talk about the structure that runs through most of Abram and Sarah's life. So one of the themes that we've looked at, there we go, is, art, right? Earlier, at the time of Noah, we looked at some of the, medieval and Renaissance and early modern portraits of Noah. This is a woodcut showing God calling Abram. But we're gonna ask ourselves, what can we learn from the setup? In other words, the back half of Genesis 11 after the Tower of Babel, which a lot of people just think, oh, it's a list of begats, right? So-and-so had a son and lived so long, and then his son had a son and lived so long, and so on and so forth. There's actually quite a bit there we can learn from. And then we're going to look at the overall form of the adventures or the trials of Abram and Sarai.
I'm on it.
One of the wonderful things of the Episcopal Church or the Anglican Church is we read, normally we get an Old Testament reading, a psalm, an epistle, and a gospel reading every week or even every day. But those are coming, little chunks, boom, 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 boom. What happens when you step back and look at all of these 11 adventures or 11 trials as a unified whole and say, what can we learn from those? That's what we're going to do. So Genesis 1:11 takes place in Mesopotamia. Now, I know you might challenge me, Tom, we don't know the Garden of Eden was in Mesopotamia. You're right. The best evidence that's internal to the Bible suggests it's sort of in the border of Syria and Turkey today, which would qualify as, more or less Mesopotamia. Two of the four rivers that are mentioned are the Tigris and the Euphrates, so that kind of qualifies. Certainly the Tower of Babel is in Mesopotamia. The first 11 chapters are universal. All humanity is descended from Adam, Eve, Seth, Noah, and Noah's wife. It answers universal questions. How are we created? What is our role in creation? Why is there evil in the world? Why was there a flood? And the works we compared it to or thought about were Paradise Lost, right? Genesis 3, East of Eden, Genesis 4, the Iliad, Genesis 6, and Aristotle's Politics, which actually has a lot of parallels to the Tower of Babel. Now we have a big transition. We're leaving Mesopotamia. We're going to Canaan and Egypt. In fact, we don't really return to Mesopotamia until the captivity, right, in Babylon. We're going to focus on one family, Abram, Sarah, and their progeny. And we're going to ask different questions. What should marriage look like? Fatherhood, motherhood. Who is the proper mother? What is a suitable heir? Big, big changes. So let's go ahead and do these. Gary, can I talk you into reading verses 10 through 17? Did I lose you, Gary? Okay, I guess we lost Gary. Reverend Ruth Ann,
I don't have my Bible in front of me.
Okay, it's on the screen if you're seeing what we're looking at.
Okay. I have to minimize that so I can see it. Okay. These are the generations of Shem. When Shem was 100 years, he fathered Arpachshad 2 years after the flood. And Shem lived after he fathered Arpachshad 500 years and had other sons and daughters. When Arpachshad had lived 35 years, he fathered Shelah. And Arpachshad lived after he fathered Shelah 403 years and had other sons and daughters. When Shelah had lived 30 years, he fathered Eber. And Shelah lived after he fathered Eber 403 years and had other sons and daughters. When Eber had lived 34 years, he fathered Peleg. And Eber lived after he fathered Peleg 430 years and had other sons and daughters.
You want to keep going or should I take it, buddy?
Okay, I can keep going. When
Okay.
Peleg had lived 30 years, he fathered Reu. And Peleg fathered Reu 209 years and had other sons and daughters. When Reu had lived 32 years, he fathered Serug. And Reu lived after he fathered Serug 207 years and had other sons and daughters. When Serug had lived 30 years, he fathered Nahor. And Serug lived after he fathered Nahor 200 years and had other sons and daughters. When Nahor had lived 29 years, he fathered Terah. And Nahor lived after he fathered Terah 119 years and had other sons and daughters. When Terah had lived 70 years, he fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran.
And we're going to stop there for a second. So what do we notice? There's a formula, right? When so-and-so had lived X number of years, 29, 30, 32, he fathered someone else, and then lived after he fathered that son quite a bit longer and had other sons and daughters. And we have a whole bunch of these in a row. Few things you might notice, the length that these guys live dwindles a little bit from unbelievable to, hey, you know, there's men in the Caucasus that make it to 110. Okay, maybe. But now we have Terah live 70 years. He fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Okay, so 70 years, that's kind of late compared to his forefathers. And now all of a sudden he has 3 sons. So we ask ourselves, who else earlier had 3 sons? Well, there's 2 answers to that. Noah, right? Shem, Japheth, and Ham. And Adam, who had Cain, Abel, and Seth. So, you know, in the back of our minds, we should be thinking, what's going on here? Just as every time we hear about twins that don't get along, Romulus and Remus, for example, we think of the meme of the hostile brothers. So here we're thinking of 3 sons. Okay, I'll take these ones. Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran fathered Lot. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his kindred, in Ur of the Chaldeans. And Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was barren. She had no child. Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife. And they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Okay, so this is the 3rd set of generations in Genesis. Like Genesis 5, which is Adam and Noah, there's 10 between Shem and Abram. Noah was the first child born who couldn't know Abram. And Abram, if you look at the lives, how long they all lived, was about the last who could have known Noah. So there's 3 things that, you know, should have jarred you, right? We talked about the first one. Terah is listed as having 3 sons, all named. It's the first time in that list that there's more than one person in a generation listed. One dies, the other 2 get married, and their wives are named. Well, you know, it's funny. If you go back to Adam, one dies, that's Abel. The other 2 get married, both Seth and Cain get married. But now what's new is their wives are named. In fact, Sarai is the first woman to be named after Eve. Now, the thing about, so, okay, again, big spotlight. We're comparing Sarai to Eve. Now, Sarai was barren. She had no child. Now, what does this remind you of? Everyone has children except one. All the soldiers came home from Troy, all the ones that lived, made it through the battle, except one. That's the story of the Odyssey, right? So the Odyssey is 24 books that recaps the Battle of Troy and then tells about how Odysseus came home. We're about to get an epic of how Sarai and Abram get to have a child. And I just want to point out, there's a very clear setup of this. And the the challenge for us, because we're so used to reading scripture, the Anglican way, where we have our Old Testament reading, our Psalm, our epistle, and our gospel, is we don't look at the big arc as often as perhaps would help us. So our expectations are set. The Odyssey is going to be the story of Odysseus going home to Ithaca and his wife Penelope. He has 12 trials. Hercules has 12 trials too, right? These next chapters in Genesis are going to be the story of Abram and Sarai having an heir, and they're going to have 11 trials. I'm not making this up. You'll see them in a second. Okay, now we've done the setup. Let's talk about form. Epics, and I'm including Beowulf and Paradise Lost, use what's called chiastic structure. This is a form. Chiastic structure is taking a theme and arranging it in descending and then ascending order, or ascending and then descending. So A, B, C, C prime, B prime, A prime. Now, if you're a musician like John or involved in the opera, this is going to make a lot of sense to you, right? Because Wagner arranges themes all over the place, right? And there's one theme for the Rhine, there's one theme for redemption through love. And when they all come together, you're at the very end of Goethe-Dameron, right? And 19 hours later, it all makes sense. The forms come together. But, these forms imitate life, right? Let's take a look at Helen. Let's imagine you drive to the airport, right? What do? You drive to the airport, park your car, take a bus to the terminal, check your baggage, go through security, board the plane, take your seat, and the plane takes off. Okay, that's A through H. Now let's do H prime and go back. The plane lands. You leave your seat, deboard the plane, exit security, pick up your baggage, take your bus to the parking lot, retrieve your car, and drive home on your way home, right? So it makes sense. As human beings, this all works for us. So this helps us. Why do we do it? How does it help us? Well, first of all, it's easy to remember. And many of these works were crafted before they were written down and compiled, right? The Iliad and the Odyssey, we're pretty sure were oral stories before they were written down. And we think that's true of Genesis as well. It's one of several mnemonic, that means easy to remember, things that help you with your memory, devices. Other ones would be poetical meter, such as iambic pentameter, right? If you have da-dum, 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 da-dum in your poetry, it's easier to remember the next syllable or the next word. And then there's epithets. For example, in Homer, the wine dark sea is an example of things that help you memorize. But chiastic structure also helps us. It focuses attention on the frame, that's the outside of the story, and on the center, and compares them. A great example of this is in Heart of Darkness, right? Joseph Conrad's story. It opens and closes on the Thames, which people may not often remember. But the central action is the Congo. And it actually and explicitly forces us to compare London and the Congo. If you read the very end of it, that is absolutely clear. In the Bible, there's other places that chiastic form is used. For example, Philippians 2, 5 through 11 focuses on Jesus' humility, his obedience, and his death, which result in his exaltation. So if you ever want an example of chiastic structure, look at Philippians 2, 5 through 11 and sort of chart it out. Look at how each word is repeated and how it's used, okay? Now let's give an example of an epic, Paradise Lost. So I'm not using every example, there's a bunch here, but A, Satan's sinful actions, B, entry into paradise, C, war in heaven. And then we work our way out. C prime, creation of the world, B prime, loss of paradise. Notice that's exactly parallel to B, and A prime, humankind's sinful actions. So there's parallels between A and A prime and B prime in particular. Okay, I'm gonna pause now. Any questions on chiastic structure? Because the next slide has got a lot going on. Okay, gonna believe this all makes sense. Okay. So here are the 11 trials of Abram and Sarai. The first one, the one we're going to look today, is the start of Genesis 12. God calls Abram with a command and a promise, and Abram obeys. B, Sarai is in trouble in Egypt, right? Abram says, pretend you're my sister, and she ends up in the harem of the Pharaoh, right? C, they have trouble with the potential heir. That's Lot. D, Lot and Sodom are in trouble, right? This is the War of the Kings. E, Hagar as a host mother. F, this is the center. This is, so you should focus on F in particular, the covenant of circumcision, more commands, more promises. E prime, hosting strangers. This is the three angels. D prime, Lot and Sarai, Lot and Sodom are in trouble again. This is where Sodom gets destroyed. Now we twist the order a little bit. Sarah gets in trouble in Gerar. Once again, Abram tries to passes her off as his sister. Abram, what are you thinking here, buddy? C prime, trouble with a potential heir, Ishmael, parallel to C. And then A prime, this is the one I'm going to let Ruth Ann teach about. This is Mount Moriah, where Abram almost sacrifices Isaac. It's just really hard for me, guys. So this is our 11 trials, A, B, C, D, E, F, going in, E, D, C, and then a variant, B, C, A on the way out. And these things, look at the parallels. A and A prime, command and promise. B and B prime, Sarai in trouble. C and C prime, potential heirs. D and D prime, Lot and Sodom. It all kind of works, doesn't it? But, you know, is this legitimate? You'd say, hey, Tom, you're skipping a few stories. Yeah, the ones late in Abram's life where Sarai dies and he finds a wife for Isaac, for example. Well, you're right. Those don't involve God, which is why I left them out. But it does focus and explain some things. The covenant of circumcision is at the center. And it helps us understand what's going on with Abram passing Sarai off as his sister, right? We'll look at those stories and we'll look at what's similar and what's different about them. They are different. They also presage or, you know, sort of foreshadow the multiple times that Abram and his descendants go to Egypt because of a famine. So, okay, having set up the setup and the structure, what questions are we going to ask? If these trials are about preparation to be the forefather and foremother of the proper heir, what does it mean to be a good husband or a good wife? Who should be the heir? To whom should the heir be born? There's also political questions, right? Abram and Sarai are hanging out in Canaan and Egypt, which are populated by other people. And God's promise that Abram will get the land of Canaan. So there's some good questions there. So let's now take a look at our first little bit of chapter 12. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. That's the command. Just one command, go. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran. They set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on, still going towards the Negev. Okay, there's one command and many promises. The command is go. The promises, a great nation, bless you, a great name, make you a blessing, bless those who bless you, curse those who dishonor you. In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Land. That's a ratio of 1:8. Well, what's going to happen? Over the 11 trials, this ratio is going to reverse. And the question I'd ask you is this a sign to us that as we become more fit for purpose, as we're more ready to carry out God's commands, that we're going to get those commands? We're going to get fewer promises, fewer new promises, and more commands, that we're ready to carry out God's bidding. Now, just one or two more notes. Adventure starts at any age, so don't wait. Abram is 75 when this adventure starts. He dies 100 years later. And I'll point out, I'm Tom Johnston, not John Roberts, but Bilbo was 50 when his adventures started. So men and women, you're not too old to have an adventure. And yes, we're stuck inside due to smoke, and we can't go do as many things as we want to do to coronavirus, but there's still adventures out there waiting for us to happen. They may be adventures of the mind, they may be adventures in scripture, but don't wait. And you can learn through your adventures too. So that's the class. That's the material I've prepared, and would love to have a robust discussion, and please throw any questions you like, particularly hard ones, at me.
All of these are descendants of men as they go through. Rarely do they talk about the wives, the mothers, until they come to Jesus. And that's when apparently the line starts to go through women. What's that all about?
Question is, they talk a lot about men, rarely women, until they get to Jesus, and then they start to mention the women. It's a really good observation, Helen. They do talk about Sarai and Rebecca.
Yes.
Leah and Rachel are one of the classic examples in Genesis of hostile siblings, right? Joseph's wife is mentioned. Tamar is mentioned. But there's not a lot of women compared to the men. But when we get to Jesus, we get the 4 women in his genealogy. Tamar, Bathsheba, Ruth Ann, help me, the woman at Jericho. I'm forgetting her name. And then Ruth. Yeah, but there's a woman at Jericho that's mentioned as well. Rahab, sorry. And then when we get down to Jesus, there's a lot of focus on Mary and her cousin Elizabeth as well. I don't know, Helen, I don't have an answer. If I were to guess, I can't defend it other than a guess. It's that in God's view, and I talked about this several times, but in Genesis 2, the Hebrew words that are translated help meet, often with a hyphen between them. It's not an inaccurate translation, but it's not the best one, right? The best one for help is, it's a military term. And the way to think of it is, the way the cavalry helps the infantry, or the infantry helps the artillery, or, Scottie Pippen helped Michael Jordan, if you want to take a sports analogy, right? But it's an equal term. It's not a subservient term. And mate is actually the English word meet, meaning fit for purpose. So the way I would translate those 2 words together are that Eve is complementary to Adam, meaning she fulfills him, or she completes the parts of him that are insufficient, and he completes for her the parts that are insufficient. So it's not that men are insufficient or women are insufficient in being man or being a woman. It's that by themselves, without the other, they aren't as much as they could be if you put them together. And that Eve was properly made for Adam, and Adam was properly made for Eve, and they're equal. It's not a subservient relationship in Genesis 2. So my view would be that as we get closer to Jesus, that view of reality is coming out. And then when you come to St. Paul, who says, in Christ, there's neither Jew nor barbarian, free nor slave, male nor female, we see that vision completed. Ruth Ann, am I on solid ground there, or are you going to take me to the woodshed? No response from Ruth Ann. Okay. I'm going to take silence as consent, Helen. We'll go with that.
Tom, my college senior thesis was on equality between men and women as presented in Genesis, and I agree with you fully.
Thank you. Okay, now I'm feeling good. Thank you, Alvin. Oh, Jad's telling us Ruth Ann's not here to take me to the woodshed, so I'm fine. Okay. Any other comments or questions? Mike, Inez, Kelly?
Relates to our lives.
I'm sorry, I really don't understand how this relates to our lives. And I understand your comment about adventures at any age. I really appreciate that. And that we are definitely learning things that we wouldn't have learned if we hadn't been stuck inside. So a lot of mental and spiritual and emotional growth. But I don't see, if you don't mind,
All this genealogy.
how does all this genealogy help us?
Okay.
I just-
Sure.
I get it.
It's a great question. Let me rephrase it. How does all this help us? So the thesis of how it helps us is that God shapes us through our experiences and our adventures and our trials. That's my thesis. Okay. How do we make sense of those trials? What do we have as an example for that? So thesis, God shapes us through adventures, trials, and experiences. That's the thesis. The example is the lives of Abram and Sarai. And if you look at those lives and you read this part of the book of Genesis, you might be saying, Tom, what in the heck are you talking about? What kind of man can tell his wife to lie or mislead at best and say she's his sister and put her in the harem of a foreign potentate, not once, but twice, right? And this guy is supposed to be, some great biblical hero. And how can we learn from him? And how can we learn from her? That's the subsidiary question. And what I would say to you is, that's a really good question. And there's two things. One is, this is an epic about Odysseus or Achilles, who are the heroes of, or Hector, who are the heroes of the Iliad and the Odyssey, or about Beowulf, who's the hero of Beowulf. But it's just as much an epic story. But the shaping that goes in is making Abraham a man who walks humbly before God, and making him ready to be the forefather of a great nation, and making Sarai ready to be the foremother of a great nation, and to have the heir God wants them to have, who is Isaac. And you're going, okay, but how do we know that? How do we know that that's what this epic is about? And how do we know they're going to learn? Well, I think we know that's what the epic is about because of the setup. Because we get 9 generations of begats, ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. Then we come to a jarring halt, right? We get 3 sons named, and one of them doesn't have any kids. But he's the one that gets the command and the promise. And the command and the promise is for kids, right? For progeny. Okay? So given that setup, and then there's 11 trials, I think it's legitimate to say, and then Isaac shows up, right? And then at the end of it, what does Abram do? What's Abraham's more or less last action? It's making Isaac has Rebekah as a wife. And so we can say to ourselves, how do we apply this? We can say, God teaches us through our, it's not just through reading scripture, not just through going to the Eucharist. And believe me, I'm not one to push back on reading scripture or going to church at all. But God also teaches us through our experiences. And so the question I would ask us as a community is, how is God shaping each of us through our experiences? And how is God shaping our group through our experiences? And what's the setup God's given, right? If, Inez, you were to write my story, right? And I'm just gonna be a little personal here. When I showed it at Epiphany, my marriage hadn't ended yet. And the previous assistant to Doyle gave me a lot of counseling about that. And I wouldn't be where I am. And it's a little personal, but my divorce was the best thing that ever happened to me because it shaped me. And it wasn't pleasant. I didn't enjoy it. And I have a very functional relationship with my ex-wife right now. We co-parent. But going through a tough experience like that has an impact on you, right? And I'm not here to say, how is God working through you through coronavirus, or how is God working through you through the smoke? That's not my point. My point is that in the arc of your life, there's various things that you've learned, and that appears to be legitimate based upon this story in Genesis. And maybe you want to take some time and write down, oh, here's some of the trials I went through. Here's how I've been shaped by them and things that I can do as a result, right? Going back to my life, I've had 4 friends at work, all male, going through divorces or gone through divorces, who've reached out to me and said, hey, how do I work on my relationship with my children while we're split up? What have you learned that you can share with me? And that's what I would say. And I appreciate your question, because it will help me in looking at the next section of Genesis and saying, how do we apply this to our lives? So thank you, Inez.
Thank you. I appreciate what you shared. Would you take that form that you were speaking of, the A, B, C, D, and then the A prime? Would you say, if we were to take on this practice of writing down some of the trials we've experienced in an A, B, C type format, and then how we began to deal with those trials? I mean, would you use that same format, or is that a little too formalized?
It's a little too formalized, but I think it makes sense. Now, this is a very male perspective. It may apply to women. I don't know if it does. But one of the things, as a Boy Scout, right, you go out into the wild and you come back, right? And that lends itself to that form, right? Now, women can go explore and hike too, but when I was 16, that was less common than it is today. But actually, I'll take divorce for example. You descend into chaos, absolute chaos. You don't know which way's up, which way's down. And as you come out of that chaos, right, there's a chiastic form where you were in a stable, place, and then you go into chaos and you come out, right? But you're a changed person. And that's the great story of adventure. If you look at Bilbo, which, by the way, uses a very similar set of forms, right? You will find that a lot of his adventures are bringing out his took nature, that's his adventuresome side, and slightly repressing his baggin side, that's the stay at home and have a cup of tea side. And that form is very common, right? It occurs in Sleeping Beauty, for example. There's a form like that in Pinocchio. So a lot of these classic tales are just organized that way. And I'd encourage you to write it down.
Thank you.
Helen.
That could be true with a major illness.
Yep.
How you deal with it, it's dealt with, you come out the other end, and hopefully, as a spiritual being living a human life, we have learned what the connection is, and how we get through those circumstances. And we're not alone in those. And I just think that the gifts and skills that each person has are God-given. And those are the things that we use to reciprocate God's love and move toward a wholeness within ourselves, within our community, and further. This goes on out as wholeness based on love grows.
I agree.
I don't know if that makes sense, but.
So Ruth Ann, while you were out, we had a debate and we were wondering if you're going to take me to the woodshed or not. So you'll have to look at the recording to find out.
Sorry, I had to go help my volunteers for a minute.
No worries.
Can I raise something? It's Brindley here.
Of course.
I accept all, I accept the whole design of the epic poem and this telling of the story. But I have other issues with the Old Testament, which really came into focus following 9/11. I was much more involved and interested in going to the Middle East and seeing these pastoral societies. And we have here a pastoral society with much of the Old Testament story. So we have a pastoral society like Samson, let's say, fighting against the Philistines. But the Philistines were actually a civilized group living in towns. And we have a nomadic type of people where the man is dominant And the women, and the more than women, are either and wives and concubines, and the servants who are slaves are there as well. And reconciling that with our modern way of looking at things and the conditions of life, I at times find that very difficult. I don't always like the patriarchs of the Old Testament. They remind me too much of the Taliban and other kind of people and the way they behave in Afghanistan and the Pathan people in the Northwest frontier, in Pakistan and beyond. It's not a society that I'm comfortable with. And I think in many ways, Jesus relieved us from that and took us into a different kind of world and a different respect of humanity. I keep quiet now.
Okay. I would find it hard to argue with your perspective. I'm trying, we're here in this class, we're trying to engage the text on its own terms, which is to say, as you look at the story, what's the setup and what does Abraham learn from it? Not, again, the more I study this, the more I have a hard time holding Abraham up as an example of perfection, certainly at this stage in the story, where he, like I said, passes his wife off as his sister and lets her show up in a harem of a foreign potentate twice. And, the stories in the Old Testament get even worse. This one's mild. There's several that are even worse. If we get to the book of Judges, it gets really bad.
It certainly does.
Alvin.
The women become the heroines then, don't they, in the book of Judges? Deborah and the rest, they in fact seem to be leading the way. It's the first time the women are coming to the fore and getting a mention in the story and a place in the story, which we don't often perhaps give sufficient recognition.
You get Miriam in Exodus as well. Yeah. Alvin, you were going to say something?
I feel all sorts of strange emotions reading the story of Abraham. This is a man of, of faith, and I don't want to question his faith, but I definitely question his faithfulness. He's a person who constantly tries to take his destiny into his own hands, and in doing so, creates all sorts of problems that fall out through the centuries. And I almost wonder if the story really, for me, I know it serves as a warning to be a part of what God is doing in my life and be aware of what God is doing in my life, but don't for any moment think that I am the author solely of my own destiny, because every time he goes off trying to figure out how to politically make himself great, he falls right down the rabbit hole again.
That preaches, Alvin. You want to teach the next class?
I did Genesis last year with 6th and 7th grade, so that was what we talked about.
It's funny where he's trying to do the right thing and not take advantage of someone else, like buying the grave for Sarai. That does great, right? It's when he tries to take an advantage where he shouldn't that things don't work out. So yeah, I agree with that. Anything else?
I am too naive. Would you please explain this business of making Sarai, saying she's like his sister? I didn't follow it. He's trying to get her pregnant. This whole thing is like.
Oh, it's worse than that. Let me read it to you. It's next week's thing, but. And
it's just a question. Last thing. It's just, is Isaac the heir that she births? And is this heir by some foreign potentate? And who do we know who that is? I'm sorry.
So Inez, I'm going to read the next 11 verses for you. Okay. This is, and we're going to cover this in the next class, but this is just the setup. And there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt. Okay. Ding, ding, ding. You should be thinking of the book of Exodus, right? Or later in the book of Genesis, to sojourn there, for the famine was grave in the land. And it happened as he drew near to the border of Egypt that he said to Sarai, his wife, "Look, I know you are a beautiful woman." It really says, "I know you're a babe." Okay, let's just be clear. I know you're a beautiful woman, and so when the Egyptians see you and say, 'She is his wife,' they will kill me, while you they will let live. Say, please, that you are my sister, so that will go well with me on your account, and I shall stay alive because of you." It had happened when Abram came into Egypt that the Egyptians saw the woman was very beautiful. And Pharaoh's courtiers saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. They went well with Abram on her account, and he had sheep and cattle and donkeys and male and female slaves and she-asses and camels. And the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his household with terrible plagues because of Sarai, the wife of Abram. And Pharaoh summoned Abram and said, "What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her to me as wife? Now, here is your wife. Take her and scram." It says get out, but I like scram better. And Pharaoh appointed men over him, and they sent him out with his wife and all he had. Yeah, that's the next story, Inez. Yeah, and
Thank you. I didn't read it, so thank
no
you.
problem. No problem. Now, Pharaoh or Gerar, the dude that this happens with next, neither of them are the father of Isaac. Abram is. But yeah, that's Alvin, I'm going to ask for your help in explaining this in a few weeks. Okay, brother? Because yeah, you're probably scratching your head going, Abram, just what in the world are you doing, buddy? Yeah, I'm wondering.
Don't we all do this all the time? We all believe that we know how things are going to work. And, we try to work our way around responsibility for things. We try to talk our way through and out of, all sorts of situations where if we just came forward with the truth, with who we are, with honesty about where we're at and who our family actually is, boy, would that go a whole lot further. And, may put us in some uncomfortable positions, but my gosh, much less uncomfortable than, the situations that Abraham finds himself in, which are almost comical, to say the least.
Yep. And Inez, just to blow your mind a little bit more, go read Genesis 20 in a little bit. And Abram does it again. Yeah.
But
And
does
in
he do
Genesis
it?
26, Isaac does the same thing.
Does he do it 3 times?
Abram does it twice, and his son Isaac does it once.
That's,
So the question that I asked my 6th graders was, does Abram believe? Does he believe in the promise that God gave him? Because clearly he's always trying to work it out on his own terms. But, God promised him that he'd be made a great nation. And, he's always trying to figure out how to do it on his own. But does he actually believe? And that's
Alvin, I think you're asking the exact right question, right? And what I would say is at this point in Genesis 12, he doesn't. But when we get to Mount Moriah, apparently he does. Right? And that's the journey, right? And Mount Moriah, Ruth Ann and I have talked about this. It's a really hard section. And Ruth Ann, while you were gone, I said that you'd be teaching on it because it was too hard for me.
Oh, I was still here when I heard that.
That story troubles me deeply, so I look forward to talking about it.
It's very hard.
Well, and as I told Tom, this is I once put together when I lived in DC a group of Jewish folks and Christian folks, and we were doing Bible study together as a way to come together. And this has so much rabbinic writing on it because it is always hard. It is not an easy subject. But as I told Tom, that's something we can learn from our Jewish brothers and sisters is they wrestle with things and they don't say, oh, that's God's plan and just sort of let it go. They really, really get into how could you ask the Father to do this to his son, etc. It's always really interesting to see that other, to go back and do that as part of our tradition as well.
I agree, but it's just, it's the back of your throat, the hair on the back of your neck, the pit of the stomach. It's just, I have only daughters, but as a father, I couldn't imagine it. So, anything else, folks? We've been going for almost 50 minutes, but happy to keep the discussion going if there's more.
I don't understand the numbers there, because we all know that life expectancy really was a lot less than it is now. And when you hear of people age 70 having children, we can't believe that, right? And then this whole idea of living 200 years, 400 years, where did all these numbers come from? I'm sorry, I sound to be a real doubter here.
Well, the numbers get less, right? If you go back to Genesis 5 and then compare it to Genesis 11, the people aren't living as long as they did before. There's all kinds of theories of what's going on. All we know is that, when we get down to Exodus, people start having the lifespans that we'd expect. I think Moses was 120, 40, 40, and 40. But after that, right, people live the years that we expect. The other thing, and I don't know if this applies to the years, but I know it applies to other things. Sometimes numbers are used in a funny way. So let me give an example. So how many people are in an army? It turns out every army in the world ever that we can record from has about 100 to 150 people, men, in a company. And the reason for that is it's how many people the commander can know. So like in the US Army, if you're a company commander, you need to know everyone in your company. You need to know what they do and what their hometown is. And if you don't, your boss, the major, the lieutenant colonel, is going to come down on you, right? Because that's what you're supposed to know. Turns out that's between 100 and 150 men for almost everyone. In the Roman army, it was called a century. Now, so let's say you ask me, how big is your army? And I say to you, oh, it's 50 centuries, right? Or it's 50 companies. Well, depending upon your language, that might be 50 multiplied by 100. Well, that's not always accurate, because that company might be only 60 people or 40 people or 90 people or 150 people. But if you use the word that of 100, right, the Roman army, century, then you would think that is 5,000 people, when it's really 50 companies. Numbers in the Old Testament always matter, but numbers, the way we read them and the way our sort of North American brains interpret them, aren't always the same. So I'm not saying that's the case for ages, but I am saying that numbers can get weird. The other thing is, when you go back to Genesis 1 and what does a day mean? It means a separation, right? Night and day. So there was a distinct period. Take it from there. And I don't know the details. I'm not enough of a scholar, maybe Alvin is, to know what's going on with the ages, but I would take note of the numbers, but I wouldn't, it's not what I would ground myself in without a lot more study.
Thank you.
Alvin, am I okay with that?
I believe so. I always explain it that, the real point is that they lived a full life, or they lived in, to reach an older age. I don't know how much trust we can put in Bedouin calendars and and their ability to add things up in that time, especially considering they were doing it, probably sans any devices, abacus or otherwise. So, I think the real point is, the notion that they lived a full life.
Thank you. Okay. Ruth Ann, are we safe calling it a day?
I think so. Thank you so much, Tom.
You're welcome.
And we all, I know, I speak for myself, but I bet I speak for a lot of other folks too. We all look forward to the next session in Genesis. Thanks
Well,
so much. Sure.
I'm going to volunteer Alvin to help me, but we're going to be explaining Abram's passing Sarai off as his sister. So,
Okay, sounds good. That will be interesting.
okay. Take care.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you.
Love you all. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you.